Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can talk about the differences in thinking between borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder. I'll refer to borderline personality disorder as BPD and bipolar disorder simply as bipolar. Now, I'll answer this question by looking at the 10 signs of BPD and bipolar behaviors and the thoughts behind them. So in prior videos, I've talked about the differences between these two disorders. They are difficult to differentiate because the symptom profiles of both disorders are somewhat similar. In addition to that, somebody can have both disorders at the same time, or a diagnosis of one disorder and subclinical symptoms of the other disorder. So what that means is somebody can have the full criteria met for, say, bipolar, but they may have only a few symptoms of BPD. And again, that can confuse things when trying to diagnose these disorders. Accurately distinguishing between the two disorders is important for a number of reasons, including the fact that the treatment protocols are different for each disorder. We see that it's fairly common for somebody with BPD to receive psychotherapy. For example, they might see a mental health counselor. And it's common for somebody with bipolar to receive psychopharmacological interventions. So they might see a psychiatrist and receive prescription medications. So in this video, I'm really approaching this from the perspective of thinking, again, in terms of trying to figure out which disorder somebody may have. If we look at certain behaviors or symptoms associated with both disorders, what thoughts would we see with one disorder, and how would those thoughts be different from the thoughts we would expect to see from the other disorder? Now, when I use the term thoughts in this context, like in this video, I'm really talking about not only thoughts, but also beliefs, attitudes, and expectations. So I want to provide a summary of each disorder here. This will just be the short version because I've covered these disorders comprehensively in other videos. For BPD, we see this is conceptualized as a set of extreme personality traits. So it's a cluster B personality disorder in the same cluster as narcissistic, antisocial, and histrionic personality disorders. The symptoms are often thought of as being pervasive, so relatively constant over time. We see there are 9 symptom criteria for the disorder: frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, an unstable relationship pattern, identity disturbance, impulsivity, suicidal behavior, affective instability, so that's mood dysregulation, chronic feelings of emptiness, inappropriate or intense anger or difficulty controlling anger, and paranoid ideation or dissociation. Bipolar disorder is, of course, conceptualized much differently. We see it's conceptualized as a major mood disorder, like major depressive disorder, so it tends to be episodic. We see manic episodes, depressive episodes, and periods in between, which we refer to as euthymia or euthymic phases. So looking at this disorder, again, we have the two components, mania and depression. With mania, we see elevated mood, increased goal-directed activities, a lot of energy, rapid speech, impulsivity, grandiosity, irritability, aggression, poor judgment, difficulty sleeping, and paranoia. With the depressive episode, we see prolonged periods of sadness, somebody sleeping too much or too little, social withdrawal, feeling worthless, having difficulty concentrating, irritability, frustration, anger, and crying for no obvious reason. Now, with both of these disorders, we see cognitive distortions. That's a tendency to look at situations through a distorted lens. One way to think about this would be looking at the difference between emotions and feelings. There are 6 basic emotions: sadness, happiness, disgust, anger, surprise, and fear. Sometimes these emotions are caused by disorders. For example, with bipolar, when somebody's depressed, they tend to be sad. And when they're manic, they tend to be happy. Feelings come about when people assign values to those emotions. And the way people assign values can also be distorted. For example, it's not unusual for an individual with BPD to have a marked fear of being abandoned. So they're worried that a romantic interest is going to leave them. Sometimes they believe that this fear indicates that something's wrong with them. So they have this emotion of fear, and then they add this value to it. that they must be worthless. The disorder can also lead somebody to looking at a situation and misinterpreting it. For example, a romantic partner doesn't call or text in a particular day, so an individual with BPD might assume that that person is going to reject them. So we see misinterpretations of emotions and misinterpretations of situations. So distorted thinking doesn't cause somebody to have BPD or cause them to have bipolar disorder, but this type of thinking can make the symptoms worse. These distorted thoughts can serve to maintain the disorder. That's why it's useful for counselors to be familiar with these types of thinking and how they're associated with each disorder, and why discussing these types of thought patterns may be helpful in counseling sessions. Now, another area where the examination of thinking can be helpful is for the purpose of diagnosis. Information about actual behaviors and symptoms inform diagnostic decisions more than anything else, but looking at thoughts can reveal nuances that may not be apparent initially. Also, it can be really helpful for a counselor to better understand the perspective of a client when they know what that client is thinking. It increases the accuracy of empathy, and it's useful for planning the treatment. So as I get ready to go through this list of behaviors and the thoughts behind them, it's important to note that this is not a comprehensive list. Often people have many thoughts associated with one particular behavior, and I want to set out kind of how I'm structuring this list. I will start out with a symptom or behavior that's being observed. Now, this could be a symptom that's primarily associated with one disorder that we may see with the other, and some of these symptoms are common with both disorders. Then I will list one or more thoughts associated with borderline personality disorder, and then one or more thoughts associated with bipolar disorder. Now, with bipolar disorder, I'll also specify whether I'm talking about a manic episode or a depressive episode when I list the thoughts, and sometimes I'll list the thoughts for both manic and depressive episodes. So starting with the first symptom, this would be intense love. So in BPD, this would be the idealization phase within the unstable relationship criterion. So the thoughts for BPD: this love gives me value. I found somebody who will not reject me. This person will save me. Moving to bipolar disorder, looking at the manic phase: everything is going my way. I feel better than ever. This person is a key part of my plan. So with the bipolar disorder, we really see the connection here to the grandiose thinking associated with that manic phase. The second behavior, this will be the devaluation phase. So again, what we primarily think of as associated with borderline personality disorder. The thoughts here: I know you were planning on rejecting me, and they had no right to my love. So essentially, we see this is driven by the other person. So you have the person with BPD thinking these thoughts, but they attribute this to an external source. Moving over to bipolar and looking at mania: I don't have the patience to deal with this person. So here we see the irritability that is fairly common in the manic phase, especially if the manic phase has been going on for 3 or 4 days. Now, looking at the depressive phase of bipolar: I just want to be left alone, and hatred will drive people away. And also, I have no energy to deal with people. So we see with depression, there's no patience or energy to contend with relationships. So again, looking at idealization or devaluation on BPD, we see perhaps the same behavior sometimes with bipolar, but for a very different reason. Moving to the third behavior, here we see the anger, and I'm going to specifically include short temper as part of that. So kind of a hair trigger, being very sensitive to stimuli and kind of overreacting. So from the BPD perspective, you are to blame for the way that I feel. So again, we see that the other person is the focus, right? There's this external locus of control we see with BPD. From the bipolar perspective, looking at mania: I have things to do and you're slowing me down. Also, I have no idea why I'm angry. Now, this is fairly common with bipolar disorder. So the person is very focused on completing a goal and they don't want people to get in their way. But also, in terms of the anger, there's no clear precipitating factor. Often for people with bipolar disorder, they can't explain why they are angry. They can't offer a theory or a thought as to why that anger occurred. With borderline personality disorder, the person usually does have a theory about what led to the anger. Looking at behavior number 4, this is the chronic feeling of emptiness. From the BPD perspective: I will never find peace, or I am unlovable. From the bipolar perspective, specifically depression, I am worthless. So really we see the thinking is somewhat similar, moving from BPD to bipolar when it comes to that feeling of emptiness. Behavior number 5 is the tendency to engage in self-harm. From the BPD perspective, I feel as though I'm about to be rejected. This is the only way I can feel something, and now people will pay attention to me. From the perspective of bipolar disorder, looking at mania, I'm invincible, right? So this is a function of feeling powerful and just taking risks. From the depressive episode side, if I'm always going to feel this way, life isn't worth living, right? So we see very different views on self-harm moving from mania to depression, and of course moving from borderline personality disorder to bipolar disorder. Behavior number 6, this is mood swings. It's referred to as affective instability when we're talking about BPD. So from the perspective of BPD, my environment is changing and unstable, so my reaction makes sense. The way people are treating me is causing this, and my feelings are justified. So here we see this idea that the individual BPD is really reacting to the environment. They perceive the world as changing around them, and they are simply coping in what they believe is an appropriate manner. From the perspective of bipolar disorder, looking at mania, I feel great, and looking at this from the perspective of depression, I feel down. So here we see the recognition that the feeling is coming from the inside. It's being driven by bipolar disorder and not something that's external. Also notice it's very straightforward from the perspective of bipolar disorder. Again, I feel great or I feel down, right? There's not a complex explanation for it like we kind of see with the borderline personality disorder thoughts. Behavior number 7, this is resistance to rational thought. We see this with both BPD and bipolar disorder. Sometimes when they're working with a counselor, it doesn't seem like they can really be reasoned with. So it's a refusal to appreciate the origin of behavior, a refusal to be treated. We see a lot of resistance here. From the BPD perspective, I am right and the world is wrong, and my feelings cannot be the enemy here. They must be correct. So this really highlights this theory that, with BPD anyway, feelings contain wisdom. And actually, this is fairly common among all of the personality disorders. Looking at this from the perspective of bipolar disorder, mania, the world doesn't understand how great I feel. No one is thinking clearly but me. Again, the individual with mania doesn't want the world to interfere with their good mood. This is actually remarkably common in the manic phase. Also, it's important to note here that the psychosis explains the resistance to rational thought in bipolar disorder. So when we think about thoughts maintaining or contributing to symptoms, when it comes to psychosis, the thoughts are of the psychotic nature. So it's not like the person with bipolar disorder can necessarily step back from the psychosis and have thoughts about that psychosis. The break from reality drives the thoughts. So the thoughts are about the psychotic content. So that's much different than borderline personality disorder, where somebody might be resistant to treatment, but they can have thoughts about that from a distance. They can recognize that they are resistant to treatment and offer their thinking on that. Again, with bipolar disorder, the psychosis kind of envelops the person's thinking. Behavior number 8, this is escalation, right? And we see this with both disorders. The symptoms, at least within a phase, tend to get worse, like in bipolar disorder, and from time to time can get worse with borderline personality disorder, especially if a relationship is kind of falling apart, right? So we see escalation for different reasons, but either way, we see escalation again in both disorders. So from the perspective of BPD, people don't understand how hurt I am. I'm going to ramp things up until they understand. So this seems to be rooted in frustration. The individual is not getting their way, and they don't feel like they're being understood. From the perspective of bipolar disorder, looking at mania, I have to achieve more. So this really highlights the progression of an episode. Typically, as mania progresses, the goals become more grandiose, more fantastical, more unrealistic. So there is a progression. In essence, the mania usually gets worse, right? So it starts off as a low level of mania and then really progresses And as that happens, we see an escalation across a broad variety of behaviors. Some of them can be somewhat dangerous, especially to the individual with the disorder. Moving to behavior number 9, this is impulsivity. Now, this is an interesting symptom because we see this fairly continually in borderline personality disorder, but we also tend to see this continually in bipolar disorder, even when somebody's not in a manic or depressive phase. So impulsivity is present even during euthymia, right? So again, that makes it kind of unusual as compared to a lot of these other symptoms that I've been talking about. So looking at this from the BPD perspective, there is no time to waste. And if I act immediately, people understand how serious I am, right? So there's a recognition that they're jumping right into things without really thinking too much about the consequences. With bipolar disorder, looking at mania, I know exactly what I'm doing, right? There is a definitiveness to the behavior that we see in a manic phase when it comes to impulsivity. The decision doesn't appear to be impulsive from that person's perspective. They feel like they have everything sorted out. They know exactly what they're doing, and it's all going according to plan. Again, with mania, we see a euphoria. The individual feels better than they've ever felt before, or better than they often feel. And with that comes an extreme level of confidence. So this takes me to number 10, the last behavior here. This would be grandiose plans. From the BPD perspective, I have found my true love. I cannot fail. So this really touches on the narcissistic component that we sometimes see with BPD. When looking at narcissistic personality disorder, we know that one of the symptom criteria is fantasies of success and power, and this includes a fantasy of an ideal love. Well, this fantasy of an ideal love is also common with BPD, although it's not one of the official symptom criteria. It's just an associated feature. So this really puts more light on this idea that NPD and BPD are in the same cluster. That makes sense in light of these types of similarities between borderline and narcissistic personality disorders. Now moving over to bipolar, looking at the manic phase, everything I touch will turn to gold, and losing is not a possibility, right? So again, we see the extreme confidence. This really lines up with grandiosity quite well. So there is a narcissistic component sometimes to mania. A great example of this tendency is the gambling that we often see in the manic phase. So especially as the mania really ramps up, often people will come forward and say, well, I'm going to go to the casino, I'm going to gamble, and I know I'm going to win big. Or I have a system and I can't lose. That's pretty common too. So it's just really an unrealistic level of confidence, kind of extreme grandiosity, even more so than we typically see with borderline personality disorder. So there are some ideas on borderline and bipolar behaviors and the thoughts that may be driving them or contributing to them. I know whenever I talk about topics like comparing two disorders, there will be a variety of opinions. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.